Today I'm talking to Jonathan Scott, legendary photographer and filmmaker, often referred to as the Big Cat Man. Jonathan's going to share with us some of his reminiscences about photography, about wildlife, about Africa, and about the state of conservation and the world. Jonathan, thanks for joining us.
It was actually quite interesting thinking about, becoming a photographer because I've sort of been interested in at school. There was a photography club, and like many youngsters, thought it was fascinating to be in the dark room and then, being a pain in the backside to the family because I'd have prints in the bath, sort of washing off the chemicals. But so I don't, and my dad was an architect and I inherited an artistic facility. I could always draw. And so I liked the idea of being a photographer. And when I left school, went to university, and then on to America and started traveling, I began to think about it a little bit more seriously. And ironically, when I set off overland from London after graduating with a degree in zoology, set off overland, London to Johannesburg, 6,000 miles, 4 months, Bedford trucks, 1974, I thought, okay, I'm going to get a real camera. So by chance, I got pointed towards a Canon, and it was a Canon camera, which was actually, it was going to help me in as much as it was one of the first semi-automatic cameras. It would leave you to set the speed, the shutter speed, and it would take care of the aperture. So I thought. So I set off. I spent 175 quid on the camera body, realized that I should actually, much later, I realized it's all about the lens rather than the camera, it's the glass. Had 30 quid left to buy a lens. So I bought a Tamron 80 to 250 zoom lens, which was pretty nice. And the trip itself cost about £500. So I then, invested all this money in the camera, was in paradise taking what I believe would be these amazing pictures on my journey down, and got as far as Nairobi, went to the camera shop in Nairobi, very excited. I could only afford black and white pictures, and I was going to get little contact sheets where 36 images all on an A4 piece of paper. And I had about 30 rolls. And a couple of days later, I went back, and as I walked through the door, I looked at the man who I'd given the pictures to, and I just saw his face drop. And I thought, well, it can't be just about me or the way I look or, whatever. And I said, was there a problem? He said, there was a problem. He said, there is nothing on the pictures. And I said, what? He said, well, that's not quite true. There's a couple of camels where there was very bright light. There was a couple of properly exposed pictures, but everything else is just black. And then I realized I hadn't read the instruction manual, and I had thought that I had a lens which would attach to the camera and I could set the aperture ring to EE, electronic exposure, and it would sync. I had an adapter to sync a Tamron to a Canon camera because it was a different sort of make. But what I didn't have was an adapter where it would allow the automatic settings. So as the camera recognized that the settings I was shooting at was according to the light, and it would do it for me. No way. So I'd been taking pictures at f/22, which is equivalent to a pinhole, hence a couple of camels. And it was like, oh my God. And of course, in today's world, if it had been digital, I wouldn't have waited 3 months to see what I was getting. I'd have looked on the back of the camera and seen, oh, crikey, something's not working here, and realized I had to adjust the aperture manually. So I became a photographer by having my teeth pulled out. And it was pretty damn painful, I can tell you, because I had these visions of what my pictures were going to look like, and I didn't expect them to look like nothing.
Yeah, it's incredible how the technology has changed and improved outdoor recognition. I mean, what is your go-to setup in terms of bodies and lenses now?
Well, we've been at it long enough, and Angie, who's sort of the real photographer in the family, and the difference between my photography and hers was I was sort of driven by loving nature and a degree in zoology, and I was fascinated by behavior. So I was taking a lot of record shots. I knew nothing about the light. I often had the light coming straight over my shoulder, flat as a pancake. Angie grew up in Africa with a love of photography and a real sense of aesthetics, and she knew how to use the camera. So we've been at photography, her from childhood, me for the last 50 years, long enough to go through all of the progressions. So initially, manual cameras, manual focus, and, cameras set up such that. And then, of course, there was the sudden digital transformation. And I remember we talked to the picture editor at National Geographic, lovely lady, Kathy Moran. And we said, how many people, this would have been in the early 200s, what do they call it, the 2000s. And we said, how many of the photographers now presenting images to you are shooting film and how many are shooting digital? She said, it's like an express train. She said, you need to get on now. Don't even think about the whys and the wherefores. And of course, in the early days, people were saying, but digital images just look so washed out. They look really pretty crappy. And they didn't stand up. And you had a lot of purists who said, I'm never going to shoot digital. I love film. The colors are creamy, et cetera, et cetera. And she said, forget that, get onto it and get to use it. And of course, the benefit of digital when we did go digital was, one, you could see the images as you took them on your back screen. And it revolutionized the way one took pictures. And it also opened up with digital better low light possibilities. And of course, as a wildlife photographer or sports photographer, you're often working, certainly as a wildlife photographer, early morning, late at night. That's when things are happening and you're struggling for light. And so the only way to crack it before digital was to spend an extra £1,000 to get one more stop of light on what we would call a 300 2.8, a fast lens, lets in loads of light. Yeah, and it would cost you the same as a house in those days. So it was hugely expensive. And then from digital now, of course, and I think most people will know this who are interested in photography, you need to go to mirrorless because mirrorless cameras are lighter. You can shoot at ridiculous speeds. I mean, you can shoot a stills camera with so many images, just 150 images a second. It's like video. And the ISO capability, so the sensitivity of the sensors now are ridiculous. You can shoot where you can barely see there's any light and it can look like daylight. So we've gone down that route. And we were very fortunate, I think, rather like with an exhibition, you've got somebody who's offering you an exhibition, paying the bill for you to see your pictures writ large. In the same way, photography can be an extremely expensive business or hobby or profession, whatever way you're looking at it. You're looking at spending thousands of pounds for your lenses and thousands of pounds for your cameras. So we were very fortunate to be sponsored by Canon and be Canon ambassadors for 10, 12 years. And that meant you had equipment you could use for free on long loan, and you weren't bearing the cost. Because I tell you, making a living as a photographer, and I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but it's jolly hard work. And it's today the value of a single image is so diminished by the volume of images that are out there. I mean, in Getty Images alone, a picture agency, they've got about 300 million images. And so where before we could make our pension in terms of taking images, putting them into a slide agency, a picture agency, they would then remunerate them by selling the copyright to magazines, books, perhaps even better, an advertising agency, and you could make real money. Well, now, as one person said, yeah, forget it. The single image, the benefit to you of your images now is not in selling prints necessarily or remuneration from books and picture agencies. It's building your profile on social media, building your brand. And so that's where the value of the images really comes in.
So you picked up a niche, I think, very early on as the big cat people.
Yeah.
Just talk us through how that came about. Was it by a deliberate choice of a sort of niche, or did it happen by chance and you just went with the flow and rode with it?
I think one of the most important things for anybody, and it is a real huge benefit in today's world, that you have a shop window. Anybody, in a sense, can create a product, and they don't have to have a shop or an office or a business. They've got the internet, and you can create a brand, you can create a YouTube channel, you can have Instagram. And I mean, the popularity of Facebook or Instagram or Twitter or TikTok, and which of those sort of genres you should be placing your work to get the maximum visibility. Because you don't want to just get millions of likes from people who will never actually buy your products. You want to actually be putting your work towards people who might actually be interested in helping you monetize it. But I think the big thing is there's no excuse for anybody today to say, well, what am I going to do? You know, I don't know how, I haven't got a job. And that is going to be, when we talked at Christ Hospital, my school, while we've been over here, and talked to the pupils. And I talked to one of the teachers and said, what is it like for young people now? You know, when we and you were youngsters, we went to school. If we were able to, and lucky enough, we went to university. And if you went to university and had a degree, it wouldn't have mattered what it was in, you would get a job. So if you took a degree in zoology, I was lucky. I followed my passion and stayed in nature. But a lot of my friends ended up as corporate heads and business, working for Ciba. They became businessmen, but they could walk through the door and get a job. He said, you know, it's really, youngsters are worried. Where am I going to find a job? I've got all the credentials that should people, a little bit like we find in Kenya. You know, you're encouraged to take a degree, whatever it is, and then you walk on the tarmac and look for a job, and it's jolly tough. So, but I do think, and going to your original question, the big cat people, you have the chance, and you need to, if you're self-employed or running a business, you've got to have a brand. And so because we had, and I think it's also, if you can, it's good to have credibility with your brand. And so if people said to us, well, why have you called yourself the Big Cat People? And they hadn't seen, for instance, Big Cat Diary or whatever it is, we can say because we've been watching the lions and the leopards and cheetahs for 50 years. You know, most people say, oh my God, you know, it's before my dad was born or whatever. So we know what we're talking about. And we are the big cat people, in as much as people will say to us, they'll go on our Instagram or Facebook and they'll say, my goodness, you know, we were thinking of doing an African safari. Can we come with you? Because you must know where the big cats are. And of course, we knew from, say, Big Cat Diary, the success of that, how we ended up with people literally coming to the Masai Mara or Kenya because they'd seen it on telly and they wanted to experience it themselves. So finding the right brand, the right niche. And as one person said, and I think it's very good advice for a youngster, what are you good at? What do you love? And can you turn that passion into a job? You might not be able to, but if you can, that's the way to go.
Absolutely. So you're talking about the Mara reminds me of all the times I've spent there as well, and traveling around Africa. Just share a couple of highlights of adventures that you've had on the way.
Well, I think, you know, I've never forgotten when I did my degree in zoology. So now I was academically qualified. I didn't want to then stay in academia. I didn't want to tell my professors and students and you know, advisors of studies, I don't want to be like you, sitting in a lab, you know, talking about it. I want to go and experience nature. And I remember having graduated, so 4 years, got a good degree, didn't want to do a PhD and carry on getting, you know, degrees because there was no reason or no benefit in doing it. And my professor at university, I was at university at Queen's University in Belfast, which I loved, in Northern Ireland. And but he said to me, well, what next? So I said, well, what I'd really love to do is to go to Africa and do something with wildlife. And he tried, I think, to sort of suppress a smile and a look of fatherly concern. And he just said to me, and by any chance, do you have a private income? I said, no, I don't. He said, well, what does your dad do? So I said, well, my dad was an architect, but he's no longer alive. And he said, oh, I'm terribly sorry about that. But he said, that's a pastime. He said, that's not a career. You're going to need to get a job. Anyway, I ignored his advice, went overland through Africa, and eventually got the opportunity. I had the trip took me from London to Joburg, and I had an onward boat ticket because to get into South Africa, they want to make sure you're going to leave. Onward boat ticket from Cape Town to Sydney in Australia, which I sold because I'd come through the Mara Serengeti And I suddenly saw the savanna Africa that I had been riveted by, on programs, Armand and Michaela Dennis, on Safari, Born Free, George and Joy Adamson or Virginia McKenna, their journey of relocating a lion cub back to the wild. And I thought, that's what I want. And then I saw it and I thought, oh my God, it actually exists. It's not just on telly. So I got the chance after 2 years in Africa, traveling overland back up from Botswana, and I bumped into a friend I'd been at university who knew somebody who had a camp in the Mara, and it was owned by Richard Leakey, the famous, archaeologist, anthropologist, and Alan Root, the extraordinary Alan and Joan Root, the photographers. And they'd started a camp because so many people came to them and said, we'd love to experience Africa with you. Well, they needed to carry on with their regular jobs, but they formed a company and sold their name. So they wanted somebody to go and keep an eye on it. And they couldn't pay any money. And I said, that's fine, as long as I can drive people around, learn to be a guide, which I did. And I remember one of the very early game drives, and I was with who became my mentor, Joseph Rotich, who we called Bwana Chui, Mr. Leopard. I thought, my God, this is the cat I most want to see. But forget leopards for the minute. He takes me in the car on a recce, showing me around, and he says, let me take you down to Musiara Marsh, just inside the reserve. He said, there's a pride of lions here. And he said, I want to show you them. Anyway, we drove to a rise, and at some point he stopped. And with what you think is amazing vision, but it's knowledge and insight that is really what it is, he puts up his binoculars, he looks, he says, there's a couple of male lions down by the edge of the forest there. Do you want to go and look? And I just thought to myself, oh my God, here I am. I'm now going to be living in this extraordinary wildlife paradise, not even realizing at that time how it was absolutely the ultimate place to be going, looking for big cats and living my dream. And I thought, and I could hear the professor's words, forget it, you're wasting your time. And I'm okay, I wasn't making any money, but and he took me down, and these lions stood up, and they just their manes were just blowing in the wind, and they lifted their noses up and they looked across the marsh. I can't even begin to explain or describe the excitement, the visceral sense of how extraordinary this place was, how extraordinary big cats were, and the fact that I was now going to spend time watching them. And so that was extraordinary. But I think another one would have been, when I first got there, the leopard was the creature I most wanted to see. And I'd been taken to Regent's Park Zoo as a kid. I was brought up on a farm, annual visit to the zoo. And I would always go to the big cat enclosures, and there would be a sign, leopard. And of course, you'd see nothing because it would be hidden away in its cave, nocturnal animal. So I'd stand there patiently waiting, no sign, never saw it. But when I came to Africa, I thought, this creature embodies my dream of Africa, something secretive and magical and beautiful. But when I got to the Mara, the leopards were under the cosh. I mean, in the 60s, 70s, they estimate 50,000 leopards were being killed a year for the fur trade, not just in Kenya, in Africa. So any leopard, which had survived, kept its head down. But at one point, I got to know a leopard. It took me 6 years to do that first book, The Leopard's Tale. And there was one picture in it, which was a female, very shy, who had got cubs in a cave. There was a drought. She couldn't move them. And there was a slash, a great gash in the cave. And she would come out, and briefly, if you were lucky, she would pause almost on a pedestal of rock that had been sculpted. You couldn't have imagined a better setting. And on one occasion, this female came out, paused for a moment, crouched, and her shape sort of just matched perfectly the indent in the rock, looked across from me and gone. And I got the picture. And I think that, and even if I look at it today, I always say to people, if I never, ever take another picture of a leopard, I've had, and I think that's one of the things for having done what I've done for as long as I've done. I have that reservoir, that reserve, that library of imagery and stuff, which really I just feel like the luckiest person in the world. And of course, I then met Angie and had a partner. We cracked the mold because most photographers, one person's vision through the camera, you behind the camera. It's about you and your vision. And so most photographers are single and go around the world. And if they've got a wife, she'll be at home, or if they've got a husband and they're traveling and getting their pictures. So to be able to have a partnership and you got two lots of hands, two ways of seeing, you can make the most of all the kit you've got. And you need to have the right person because it sounds incredible to be a wildlife photographer, but it could mean long days in a car with a bunch of lads who are doing absolutely nothing. But you daren't leave because if you do, you'll come back. There'll be another photographer who'll say, "Oh my God, you don't know what you've missed." And it's like, oh.
Yeah, yeah. Looking the other side of the lens there behind you, the state of conservation in Africa, is that still cause for concern?
Angie and I both agree that as wonderful as what you see on television and in books portraying the natural world, it's a bit of a myth because I know and we know from personal experience, whether it's television or a book, whether it's a publisher or a producer, they don't want to give bad news to people. So they want a buoyant and upbeat story. And I know, for instance, with Big Cat Diary, filmed in the Mara, this extraordinary place, but with real issues of encroachment by cattle into the reserve. The marsh lions we'd watched for so many years, 2015, 8 of them were poisoned, 3 of them died. Conflict with people, human wildlife conflict. But we were always told, don't even think about going near the conservation stories. It'll depress people. Plus, the authorities will probably say, well, we're not going to give you, credit to be able to come and film in the reserve and make it easier, give you discounts or not even have to pay your fees. If you start talking about politics of, should cattle be allowed to come in or not, what happens when animals are killed or poisoned. So, and with the same with books, we portray this myth of wilderness. And I mean, whatever we are portraying to people to this day, whether it's on, series on the oceans, whether it's on, above water, whether it's land-based migrations or whatever it is, I don't really know of many places where I would say I am optimistic about the future because let's take Africa, for instance, by 2050, if you can believe what people say, and I think that's the date they give, the population will have doubled. Well, already there is huge pressure on the land. Look at a country like Kenya. There's large parts of it which are inhospitable to people and livestock holders and being able to survive dry parts. Look at northern Kenya, millions of people, semi-starved at times over these terrible droughts that we've had and the whole unpredictability of the future with global warming. To give you an analogy, which puts it, I think, always into perspective, if you had a piece of paper and you broke it up into little squares and you then looked at the weight of mammals on Earth, so biomass, the weight of mammals on Earth in comparison to each other, a third of that picture would be taken up by us, by weight, and 2/3 virtually of the rest of it is actually our domestic livestock, whether it's birds, camels, horses, pigs, chickens, whatever. So 4% of that total picture is wild mammals. 4%. I mean, we just, the pressure on the land is, and no politician is going to prefer a wildebeest over a human being. They won't last very long if they do. And I mean, when I look at the sea change that we're seeing politically right now with a swing towards, right-wing parties to people who are saying, we're just going to carry on digging up, non-renewable resources, to hell with sort of, trying to actually create a better world. We're just going to live in the moment. Well, if we continue to do that, we're already seeing, you know, whether it's fires, whether it's melting glaciers, whether it's water restrictions, the earth is crying out for us to listen. And yet we seems our leaders are not doing a great job on that front. And it always actually surprises me, because going back to that professor, and you know, natural history is the great British pastime. You know, people have always gone out and collected butterflies and birds' eggs and loved nature. Well, England's or Britain's record on conservation, from what I gather, is not the greatest. And of course, for countries like Kenya and Africa, they're sitting there on the sharp end of the impact of the rest of the world on their environment. And I think we're so getting back to these big television productions, lavishly produced, constantly new ways of showing us our world, and they always end up, and I want to scream, they always end up with a positive message. Even the wonderful David Attenborough, you know, will pull back, and you could say, but you have to remain optimistic. I remember that saying, better to light a candle than curse the darkness. I think it's all very well and good to end a series by saying, but there is still time. Well, we've been saying that for a long time now, and there is less time than there was. And you'll remember the doyen of biologists, E.O. Wilson, who died recently, who, you know, in, I think, 2016 said, or in that sort of, you know, let's say 20 years ago, 10, 20 years ago, said, we need to set aside, if we set aside half of the world for nature, make nature the priority, we can still make it. Well, I like to think, because Angie often says, you know, are we really still on the right track? And I say, yes, we've got to keep trying to reconnect people to nature. But boy, oh boy, we are running out of time.